Before Britain ruled a quarter of the world, before its navy dominated the seas, before the sun was said to never set on its empire, there was sugar, there was tobacco, there was cotton, and behind them all there were chains. The history of Britain and slavery is not a simple story of villains and heroes. It is a story of ambition, profit, cruelty, resistance, and eventually abolition. It is a story that helped shape the modern world. In the 16th and 17th centuries, England was expanding outward. European powers were racing to claim territory in Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. Colonies meant wealth. Wealth meant power. Power meant survival in a competitive imperial world. At first, England played a smaller role in the transatlantic slave trade compared to Spain and Portugal. But that would soon change. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, Britain became one of the dominant forces in the transatlantic slave trade. British ships sailed from ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, carrying manufactured goods to West Africa. Their traders exchanged goods for enslaved Africans. Those captives were then transported across the Atlantic in brutal voyages known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on these ships were horrific. Human beings were packed tightly below deck for weeks or months. Disease, dehydration, and violence were common. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were sold in the Caribbean and the American colonies, forced into plantation labor, producing sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton. These goods were shipped back to Britain, refined, and sold across Europe. This triangular trade generated immense wealth. Sugar became known as white gold. British consumers developed a taste for sweetened tea and confections. Unaware, unwilling to confront the suffering behind every spoonful, entire cities grew wealthy from slavery. Liverpool became one of the largest slave trading ports in the world. Banks, insurance companies, and investors financed voyages. Profits flowed into infrastructure, industries, and institutions that would shape modern Britain. Slavery was not hidden, was embedded into the empire's economic system. Yet slavery was not confined only to distant colonies. While chattel slavery was not formally established on British soil in the same way it was in the Caribbean, enslaved people were brought to Britain. Legal ambiguity surrounded their status, and in 1772, the Somerset case ruled that slavery was unsupported by English common law, effectively preventing forced removal of enslaved people from England. But this did not end Britain's role in slavery abroad. By the late 18th century, something began to shift. Voices of resistance grew louder. Enslaved people resisted daily through slowdowns, sabotage, escape, and rebellion. Major uprisings in the Caribbean shook the foundations of plantation society. One of the most significant revolts occurred in Jamaica in 1831, known as the Baptist War, led by Samuel Sharp. It demonstrated that slavery was not a stable system, it was a system under constant pressure. At the same time, a powerful abolition movement was rising within Britain itself. Figures like William Wilberforce, Olaudah Equiano, Thomas Clarkson, and Granville Sharp campaigned tirelessly against the slave trade. Equiano, a formerly enslaved African, published a powerful autobiography that exposed the horrors of slavery to British readers. His first-hand account humanized a system many preferred to view abstractly. Activists organized boycotts of slave-produced sugar. They circulated pamphlets. They gathered petitions signed by thousands of ordinary citizens. Churches became centers of moral debate. The question was no longer only economic, it was ethical. In 1807, after decades of activism, Britain passed the Slave Trade Act, officially abolishing the transatlantic slave trade within the British Empire. British ships could no longer legally transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. But slavery itself still existed in British colonies. It would take another generation and continued resistance from the enslaved for full abolition to arrive. In 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, ending slavery throughout most of the British Empire. Nearly 800,000 enslaved people were legally freed. However, the end of slavery was not the end of injustice. Former slave owners were compensated financially by the British government for the loss of property. The enslaved received no compensation. Many were forced into apprenticeship systems that prolonged exploitation. The economic impact of slavery, however, had already reshaped Britain. Profits from plantation economies helped finance industrial development. Ports expanded, textile industries grew, insurance and banking systems matured. Some historians argue that wealth generated by slavery played a role in fueling Britain's Industrial Revolution. The legacy of slavery did not disappear with abolition. It left deep scars in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the Americas, and within Britain itself. Racial hierarchies developed to justify the system would echo into the modern era. Yet Britain also became a global force against the slave trade after 1807. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic, intercepting illegal slave ships. Thousands of enslaved Africans were liberated from captured vessels. Britain pressured other nations to outlaw the trade. This dual legacy is complex. Britain was both one of the largest slave trading powers in history and one of the first major powers to abolish the trade and later slavery itself. It profited immensely from human suffering and later spent resources trying to dismantle the system it once dominated. History is rarely simple. The story of Britain and slavery is not only about economics or politics, it is about people. Millions of Africans whose lives were uprooted, families torn apart, cultures disrupted, communities that endured unimaginable hardship and still survived. It is also about resistance enslaved individuals who refused to accept bondage as destiny, about activists who challenged powerful economic interests, about a society forced to confront the moral cost of its prosperity. Today, debates continue about how this history should be remembered. Statues, institutions, and wealth linked to slavery are re-examined. Conversations about reparations and historical accountability remain ongoing. But one truth is undeniable. Slavery was central to the growth of the British Empire, and the legacy of that system helped shape the modern world. The ships have long since stopped sailing. The plantations are quiet, the laws have changed. But the echoes of that era remain in economies, in societies, in identities. Understanding Britain's role in slavery is not about rewriting history, it is about facing it. Because only by understanding the full story, the ambition, the cruelty, the resistance, and the reform, can we begin to grasp how the past continues to shape the present.